I've challenged myself to be able to kneel on the floor with the kids as long as possible. So it's a good goal for me to do my stretching and everything. Cool. All right, well, I'm Jacob, if we haven't met. I've met many of you, but a couple of you not. So it's good to have you with us. We're going to be in Mark chapter 11 today. Mark chapter 11. We started last week. Today is officially the first Sunday of Lent. Wednesday was Ash Wednesday. Lent is the season leading up to Easter, where we reflect on our need for a Savior. So we reflect on our humanity and our brokenness and our need for Jesus to come as our Savior. And so as we approach Easter, what we're doing this year is each Sunday we're covering a different day of Holy Week. So I had to say this like 3 times when we were talking about it as a team in planning. So this week is Monday in Holy Week. That's what we're looking at. Okay. Last week we looked at the triumphal entry, which is Palm Sunday. Now we're looking at Monday. And so Holy Week is the week that Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem leading up to his crucifixion and resurrection. And so it's the climax of the Gospels, this Holy Week. And the theme for us is pilgrimage, because it's a journey of faith for Jesus and his followers as he's moving toward the cross. And so we're extracting out of this story for ourselves. We're reflecting on the lessons for our own spiritual journey, right? As we identify more and more with Jesus. And so last week we talked about Jesus entering Jerusalem and being hailed as a king, and about how everybody around him was celebrating, but he knew he was going to his death, and how that was hard but good. So I'm going to just narrate for you here the story, because at the end of that portion on Sunday of Holy Week, it says in Mark 11:11, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So Bethany is where his friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, lived. And it seems like whenever Jesus was in Jerusalem, because he was in there, they would travel to Jerusalem for religious festivals, he would stay with them. And Bethany to Jerusalem center is probably like walking across DeLand, like just the center of DeLand. So it's not far, but it's a fair walk, right? But from Jerusalem to Bethany is not as far as like DeLand to DeBerry. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like just walking across town. So they go out. They're staying in Bethany and walking into Jerusalem each day. And so, but it's interesting because Jesus enters Jerusalem as a king. He goes to the temple because he's being hailed as king. That's sort of like a ceremonial act. Now he could have gone to the temple just because that's where you go when you're a traveling teacher and you teach from there. Could be because that's what everybody is doing when they come to Jerusalem for the first time for the festivals. I think there's also some symbolism as he's entering Jerusalem as the Messiah. He's going to the place where God dwells, but no action takes place, which is important. Which is interesting because of what happens next. The next day when he goes to the temple, okay? So the next day, it says, starting at verse 12, the next day as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. So this is we could unpack that episode. That's not what we're talking about today, but I read it for you because what I want you to get a sense of is on Monday of Holy Week, as Jesus is walking into town, he's just a little unsettled. He's a little ornery. Okay, so there's a lot of spiritual significance that over the years the people of God have extracted out of this episode where Jesus curses a fig tree. We're not going to talk about that. I just want to talk about this is a guy who's just a little on edge. So he's hungry, and when there's a fig tree that's not producing any figs, he's ticked at the tree. That's how unsettled he is on this day, okay? And by the way, it wasn't even the season for the tree to produce figs. Like, it was out of season, and he's ticked at the tree for not having figs on it, okay? So he's just hungry. The other day, I was in Lake Mary for some meetings, and they went longer than I thought. I didn't have lunch, and I called Aaron, and I was just ticked because I didn't have lunch. All right. Luckily, I had McDonald's. Jesus didn't have that. Okay. So we get to now verse 15 to 17, which this is our reading for the day. Okay. So he says this, or the text says this. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." So this is our text for the day. As I read that, who says, "Oh yeah, I'm familiar with this episode"? Raise your hand high. Okay, some of us. It's a very familiar story. Like if you've been around the Bible for a while or been following Jesus for a while, you're probably aware of this story. There are some things I noticed about it that I like. It's one of those stories I'm like, oh yeah, I know that story. And then when I read it closely, like for a day like today, I'm like, oh, there are some facts I miss. Like for one, in my mind, Jesus comes and all of the activity of the temple is completely disrupted and everything stops. But actually, it says he did all these things where he like got angry with people. And then after that, verse 17, and as he taught them. So he went in, he turns over some tables, he drives out some people, he's upset, and then he just starts teaching. So it's like, it's not so disruptive that everything stops, because then he goes on to teach from there. So I have a couple of slides. Perfect. So here is the temple complex. Okay, in Jerusalem. So this is, if you've ever heard of Second Temple Judaism, you probably haven't, that's just me. This is the Second Temple. There was a Temple of Solomon that was built in the Old Testament, got destroyed during the exile. Then Herod, a political king over Israel of like shady descent, becomes the ruler over this area on behalf of Rome. And in order to curry favor with the people, he builds a bigger, more opulent temple. This is that one. So this is the temple in the time of Jesus. All right. Now, you probably can't read those labels, but what you can see is there's a big area, and which is like on the bottom there, if you've got really good eyes, you'll see on the right is like the size of this temple complex. On the left is the size of an American football field. So this is like, 12 to 15 American football fields is how big this complex is. Okay. Has anybody been there? I have not. Great. No, none of us. Perfect. So the diagram will be helpful. So what you see there is outside the main complex, it says the Gentiles' courtyard. So people who were not Jewish could get that far. To go inside that other part, you have to be Jewish. And then like there's a court you can enter if you're a Jewish woman, and then not go any farther. Then there's a court inside of that where you can go if you're a Jewish man. Then inside the building itself, you can only go if you're a priest. Okay? So go to the next slide. So here's zooming in on that part that was in the middle. And there's there's a wall there that about divides it in half. So on the right side of that wall, that's where it says women's courtyard. And again, at the top, if you have really good eyes, there's a comparison to an American football field. So this is about the size of 3 American football fields. Okay? So it's the women's courtyard out there. Then you would go past that to actually make a sacrifice. But so like past that wall, it says the gate of Nicanor. Past that wall is where you would go to make your sacrifice. But this part out, the women's courtyard, men and women could go there. There's milling about there. That's where Jesus might go and teach from there, either there or in that Gentiles' courtyard. And there might be lots of people in that area communicate, like teaching, talking, kind of holding gatherings. Okay, and so how you can imagine this is, in that women's courtyard, as people are approaching to go make a sacrifice, they need to get the appropriate animal for the sacrifice that they need to go make. And they might be traveling days and days of travel, and they don't have a dove to bring with them. So if the Old Testament scriptures prescribe that you sacrifice a dove for a certain thing, and they're going to sacrifice a dove, they just buy it outside in that women's courtyard or in the Gentiles' courtyard. And so that's the people that Jesus was addressing when he turns over tables. Because first, they have to change their money into the local money, then use that money to buy the dove. Okay? And this is where there were shady business practices. So there were people who were taking advantage of the sacrificial system to make money. And that's what Jesus is railing against. Okay? So the sacrificial system is what he's kind of disrupting here. All right? This system of trade that evolved around the religion. All right? So the sacrificial system was instituted by God through his prophets in the Old Testament. And it was a way for the Jewish people to stay connected to God even though they were sinful and broken. And so Jesus said, or God said to them through his prophets, first through Moses and then through others, when something bad happens, when you do something bad, do these things and our relationship will be restored. Now listen, this is more for the people than it is for God. Because as you know and I know, as people, we're always plagued by the guilt of our own sin and mistakes. And so we are often the ones who disqualify ourselves from connecting with God. Oh my gosh, God could never love me. And God's going, here's what I'll do. I'll just give you a system so you can know you're okay. So that you can be cleansed. Here you go. Do this, then we'll be good. Just do that. And so then what the people said was, great, we have a system. We can master this. We can make this more efficient. And they ended up building up a whole like industry and economy around that sacrificial system. This thing that was supposed to just be a way for people to manage their relationship with God and find their way back to their Creator became a whole thing unto itself. And so so it became a religion unto itself. And now, all the ceremony of it has taken precedence over the reality of it. So it's more about doing the things than it is about connecting with God. This is what Jesus is railing against. So Jesus is rejecting the religious commodification of the people's relationship with God. They've taken connection to God and they've made it a product to sell. And then people have begun to make a living and edge out profit out of the commodification of people's connection to God. Okay? So Jesus is rejecting that religious commodification. And he's aiming for a better thing. He's aiming for a better thing, which is why then after he turns over the tables of the money changers, drives out those selling doves, doesn't allow people to carry merchandise through his area wherever he is, he taught them saying, the scriptures say, it's in Isaiah, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. But you have made it a den of robbers. You have made it a place to make a buck, when really the temple was supposed to be a place where all people can access the grace and the goodness of God. What's interesting about this episode and why I think so many of you raised your hand and you knew of it is because this is a different Jesus than we see other places. Right? This is a different Jesus than we see other places. This is a Jesus who's willing to unsettle some things. Who's willing to disrupt and leave things in disrepair. I think it's contextual to where he's at in his journey. He's coming to the climax, and so maybe he has less patience, or maybe he just knows it's time to start saying the things that people don't want to say. And so, but it leaves us sort of, like, I think for those of us who think of Jesus as meek and mild and gracious and kind, an episode like this leaves us scratching our head. Because we're like, wait a minute. I like the stories of Jesus where he heals, like he raises a girl from the dead, or he heals the leper and gives sight to the blind. Like, he's putting things back together. Don't like to think of Jesus as disrupting things and taking them apart. Right? And I think, like, the religious leaders, it goes on right after that to say the religious leaders are so undone by what Jesus is doing that this is when they start to get serious about plotting to kill him. Which, again, we can be like, oh, those dastardly religious leaders. But really, like, they were just kind of regular people trying to carry on the system that was given to them by their parents and their parents' parents. And they're so undone by what Jesus is doing, they decide that he needs to be killed. Right? So we see this Jesus who's different. And I think actually like it's this part of who Jesus is that is still unsettling to us. Right? And again, like I think if we were going to identify with what's unsettling about it, it's like it's really any kind of sacrilege. Right? Well, that's sacrilegious. Anytime you're tempted to say something like that, you find what it felt like to be in the temple that day. So like we're just all here doing our devout religious thing, and here comes Jesus telling us that we're all wrong and making a scene out of stuff. That's sacrilegious. What are you doing, Jesus? It offends us, right? It disrupts us. This is like I work with a lot of churches in my other job when I do strategy consulting with churches. And like there are a lot of churches who are like, hey, listen, we have coffee out in the fellowship hall, but don't take it into the sanctuary, right? The sanctuary being the room where you have a worship service, where there's pews usually or something. And so they're like, listen, no, there's no food and drink in the sanctuary. That's a holy place. It would be sacrilegious to take your coffee into the sanctuary, right? And so when I'm trying to describe what kind of church we are to those people, I say, just so you know, we have a kitchen in the back. It's like all one room, right? Just so they know what we're like. I heard a story recently of a guy in my denomination who ran afoul of other pastors in his area. One of the things they didn't like that he did was when they were getting ready to baptize a bunch of people, they did it in a special event, and they called it a baptism bash. And the other pastors in the area said, that's just sacrilegious to call it a baptism bash. This is, you know. And you're like, you know, we can giggle at them, and then, but also that's a story I've told to people who even understand the way that we do ministry, and they're like, well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it a baptism bash. And that's like me, like even me personally, I'm like, I probably wouldn't do it that way. I mean, there's no problem for you, but why wouldn't I do it that way? Well, it's just not how I talk about baptism. It's a little sacrilegious. And doing that, being sacrilegious like that is disruptive. It's disruptive to what we expect and what we've come to know. It's a disregard for the status quo, the way things are. In this episode, where Jesus enters the temple on this Monday of the week of one of the highest holy festivals of Israel. So they're approaching the Passover festival, one of the highest holy festivals of their nation, and Jesus waltzes into the most holy place and makes a scene. It's a disregard for the way things are. And if we were going to try to identify with the religious leaders, we might say, well, yeah, Jesus, why do you got to be so aggressive about it? Like, why do you got to be so disruptive? Why do you have to be so sacrilegious? And I think the answer is because if Jesus didn't challenge it, nothing would change. So again, status quo is the way things are. If we don't challenge the way things are, things will never be different. And what Jesus is saying is, we're not there yet. We have to go forward to get to where we're going. And if we're going to get to where we're going, we can no longer stay where we are. And so Jesus is saying to the people that have come to connect with their holy Creator, with God the Father, he's saying to them, something has to change. Because this temple was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. And it's become a place where you keep the outsiders outside and you only let the women in so far. And then when they get in, you charge them exorbitant rates to participate in this ritual that helps them connect with God. That's not what this is supposed to be. It's okay if it was that for a little while, but this is not where we should stay anymore. We have to move forward to be the thing that God intended us to be. A house of prayer for all nations. You see, the temple had become a place for the Jewish people to just do sin maintenance. To just kind of clean it up a little bit. Just maintain. Just do what they could to not get completely lost in their brokenness. Just a little bit of patching over the problem. And Jesus says, Connecting with God through the place of holiness is more than sin maintenance for Israel. It's a house of prayer for all nations. There is something better, and we're not there yet. Jesus is disrupting what is in favor of what will be. Jesus is disrupting what is in favor of what will be. He's carrying the people forward by disrupting the system that they've created. I think this is a necessary part of our pilgrimage walks. A necessary part of our pilgrimage walks is that Jesus would disrupt what is in favor of what will be. That's good. Thank you. Yes. We could use more of that, people. This week, we got some news. So we've been in this building for about 2.5 years. And we had a meeting with the folks who own the building, and they were saying they have another use for it. So they said, as per our lease, we've got 6 months to figure out a different place to meet. Which when you first hear that, you're like, ugh. Just because it's kind of a pain. I mean, like, and it's like, we like it here. This is great. It was like a couple weeks ago in one of our weekly staff meetings, I was saying to Christy, I was like, next time we talk about this lease, let's just see if we can lock it in for 5 or 10 years. Actually, I said 10 years. She was like, whoa, how about 5? And then here we are, right? I think what was happening for me was like, I was ready to talk about a multi-year lease. I was like, this is nice. We could just stay here and just do this. Let's just do this, right? And then disruption comes. And I don't know what you believe about how God intervenes in our circumstance. I don't know what I believe about how God intervenes in our circumstance. I'm not saying Jesus did it. I'm just saying that when we walk with Jesus, disruption is inevitable. I'm just saying that like when we walk with Jesus, things are going to be different. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter how many times you've been through it, disruption causes fear. The unknown, the loss of control, the disruption of what is will always cause you to say, oh no, what are we going to do? Let me hold a little tighter to what I know because I'm afraid of what I don't. Disruption causes fear. This morning, Erin and I were talking. She's fine if I use her as a sermon illustration, so I have carte blanche. Yeah. She was like cleaning the windows, and then she was like, man, talking about knowing this thing that we're going to have to move. She's like, I just have less peace than I did last week. And what came to me was like, oh, that means that there's a measure of the peace that you had last week that was attached to this building, not to Jesus. And I think that's true for what we do in our life. It's like God provides something, and we put our hope and trust in what he has provided more than we do in God. And that's what happened in the temple, is God provided the sacrificial system for the people, and they put more hope in the sacrificial system than they did in God. God gives us money to live our lives, and then we put more hope in the money than we do in God. God gives us a building and a place to meet, and then we put more hope, we put more security, we put more of our sense of identity in the thing that God has provided than we do in God. And so every once in a while disruption comes, and I'll tell you what, it's an opportunity to discover what God is doing next. And we have hope and we have peace because we know how God has moved in the past, and we know that God does not change, and so God's provision then looks like God's provision today, looks like God's provision tomorrow. The reality is like for our situation, the last time we moved, it was positive. We spent less money and we got a better place. Is that like, am I thanking First Methodist for that, or am I thanking God for that? Yes. Thank you. And so what we do is we move forward and we say, okay, God, what are you doing next? The reality is that the truth is that God gives us what we need. God gives us what we need to move into what God is doing next. And so let me make this about you for a minute as we move toward the close. It's like when we walk with Jesus, disruption comes. When we walk with Jesus, disruption comes. And so it's probably true that when we live lives, even with or without Jesus, disruption comes. But let's just talk about what it means to walk with Jesus. Disruption comes. What's beautiful about Jesus is that Jesus also brings restoration. And so, like this episode where we see Jesus be so disruptive and sacrilegious is a little unsettling to us. But if we zoom out, what we see is the wholeness of who Jesus is not only that he's disruptive, but that he's restorative, that he puts things back together. And so in your life today, you might be in that moment where you're like, you know what? I could get cool with this status quo. Things are pretty good. Enjoy that. And know that disruption is probably coming. Right now, you might be in a moment where like everything has been turned over. Jesus has flipped the tables, and there's still dust floating in the air. You might be in the middle of your disruption. Know that in your walk with Jesus, restoration is coming. There will be peace again. Maybe you are in a point in your journey where you're between those two things. The disruption is maybe just behind you. You can remember what it was like, but you're starting to feel like you have your feet under you again. All you have to do is continue to put one foot in front of the other as God takes you into the restoration that is yours. And so as we consider what it means for Jesus to have walked his disruptive story into what was his to do, we can identify with him as people who are walking where he walked and doing what he did. That the disruption that comes in our lives is but one part of the story. The bigger story where Jesus takes things apart, yes, and Jesus puts things back together. Jesus might be disrupting your life today or yesterday or tomorrow, but it's all a part of taking you where you're going in the end. Amen? Amen.